U.S. fighter jets have shot down an unidentified object over Alaska. The Pentagon says President Biden gave the order after it was detected yesterday. It's unclear what the object was, but officials say it was the size of a small car. Last week, a Chinese balloon was shot down off the coast of South Carolina, with Beijing saying it was a civilian device for monitoring the weather. But in the last couple of hours, the Pentagon gave this update.
North American Aerospace Defense Command detected an object on ground radar and further investigated and identified the object using fighter aircraft. The object was flying at an altitude of 40,000 feet and posed a reasonable threat to the safety of civilian flight. U.S. Northern Command is beginning recovery operations now.
Well, our North America editor Sarah Smith is at the White House. Sarah, what's the latest?
Well, it is intriguing, Clive, how little they have been able to tell us about this object, and that's because the US authorities know very little about it at all. They admit they don't know what it was, whether it was a balloon or a drone or some other kind of object. They don't know what country it came from. They also admit that they've no idea who owned it, whether it was a nation or a corporation or an individual. They don't know what its purpose was, and they don't know whether it posed any kind of security threat. So, why then, you might ask, did they move so swiftly to shoot it down? Well, it's worth noting that there has been a huge amount of criticism here in Washington about how long it took to shoot down that Chinese balloon that was floating across the country last week. Now, security officials say that is not why they moved so swiftly in this instance. It's because the object was at around 40,000 feet and a threat to civilian planes, and also because it floated over water, which meant they were able to take it down without the risk of any casualties on the ground. All President Biden has said about it is, it was a success.
According to the Pentagon, NORAD first detected this latest unidentified unmanned object over Alaska on Friday evening. As they monitored it and tracked where it was going, it did cross into Canadian airspace. At some point today, President Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau both spoke. They had both been monitoring the situation for the last 24 hours, and they ultimately decided that out of an abundance of caution, they wanted to follow the advice of their military leaders and authorize the shooting down of this object. Now, at this point, once this operation was underway, it was ultimately an American F-22 fighter jet that shot down this unidentified object over Canada. Now, there's still so many questions about what exactly this object entailed, including the size, its origin, and its purpose. And a few moments ago, the Defense Minister of Canada talked a little bit about what they know at this moment.
Recovery operations are now underway and will be supported by the Canadian Armed Forces in conjunction with the RCMP. This coordinated operation will allow a further investigation into this object. We have no further details about the object at this time.
But for today, breaking news from Alaska. The White House says another high-altitude object has been shot down. The Pentagon says that object was flying at 40,000 feet.
But they say it wasn't as sophisticated as the Chinese spy balloon that was shot down off South Carolina. Our DC Bureau Chief Ben Kennedy is live at the White House, where we are now getting reaction from the president. Ben.
Calvin, the White House said this object did pose a threat. They had been tracking it since last night, and an F-22 shot it down at 1:45 this afternoon.
Yes, the president absolutely was involved in this decision. He ordered it.
Order downing another high-altitude object, this time over Alaska.
Do you have anything to say about the object shot down over Alaska, Mr. President?
Pilots got a close look at the unknown flying object Friday afternoon and determined it was unmanned, traveling 40,000 feet, which did pose a threat to air traffic in the area.
Civilian aircraft operate, at a variety of ranges up to 40 to 45,000 feet. So again, there was a reasonable concern that this could present a threat to or a potential hazard to civilian air traffic.
It comes after a Chinese spy balloon was shot down off the coast of South Carolina last weekend. Investigators now concluding that China's balloon seen over the country's Midwest was used for intelligence surveillance, saying it was equipped with multiple antennas that are capable of collecting communications. That refutes China's claim that it was a civilian weather balloon that had simply strayed off course. The Pentagon did acknowledge that it took longer than people may have wanted for that balloon to be shot down, but they wanted to wait until it was over open water so civilians did not get hurt from debris on the ground.
first want to bring you some breaking news that's just come into us here at Sky in the last few minutes. It's come from a tweet from the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, who has said on Twitter, "I ordered the takedown of an unidentified object that violated Canadian airspace. At NORAD Command, shot down the object over the Yukon. Canadian and US aircraft were scrambled and a US F-22 successfully fired at the objects." The Prime Minister goes on to say that he spoke with President Biden this afternoon. Canadian forces will now recover and analyse the wreckage of the object, and he goes on to thank NORAD for keeping watch over North America. Now, this is the third object that has been spotted over North America in just the past week. You'll remember, of course, that the US Air Force shot down a Chinese spy balloon last week. An unidentified object, which was described as the size of a small car, was taken down on Friday, and now a third one taken down over the Yukon. The Canadian Prime Minister telling us that, the North American Command taking charge and bringing that object down. And of course, when we get more detail on this third object flying over North America that has been brought down by the armed forces there, we'll bring that to you here throughout the evening on Sky News.
This is quite something to see, a tweet from the Canadian Prime Minister saying that he ordered this object to be taken down over Canadian skies. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, it also speaks, in fact, to the seriousness of what's happened here and the chain of command. And I will note that in this tweet, the Prime Minister also indicated, of course, this is close coordination with the White House and with President Joe Biden. At issue here, Jim, is really what is going on with these objects and the threat that they pose. Now, remember that they would have been given some kind of intelligence when NORAD had actually spotted this high-altitude object, as they're calling it, to give an indication that possibly there was a threat. I would assume that if it was over northern Canada, that Canadian forces, the Air Force, would have determined that they could shoot it down without a risk to people on the ground. And more than that, the Prime Minister is now saying the Canadian forces will lead the recovery effort, again, to ascertain exactly what this is, does it pose a threat, and who it belongs to. Because remember, in the last object, we were just talking to Natasha about that second one, still a mystery. Obviously, this a mystery as well. What is it? Why does it continue to enter both U.S. and Canadian airspace? And what can Canadian forces and the U.S. now learn from having shot it down and trying to recover the debris? We don't have any more details yet. We have reached out to the Canadian Defence Ministry to understand what kind of a recovery operation is underway and how complicated that might be. But given the way the close coordination has been happening between the U.S. and Canada, remember, through NORAD, they're all looking at the same intelligence in terms of what is it, does it pose a threat? They now need to determine exactly what to do going forward. At issue, though, Jim, the most important thing is these last two objects, who do they belong to, and why are they entering both Canadian and American airspace?
The latest now in our breaking news, the U.S. military has shot down another high-altitude object, this time near Lake Huron. This would be the third object brought down in as many days. Let's go now to CNN's Arlette Saenz at the White House. Arlette, you have new details about this object. What are you learning?
Yeah, Paula, a senior administration official providing some new details to myself, Natasha Bertrand, and Phil Mattingly, detailing what exactly this unidentified object looked like. Now, it was flying at about 20,000 feet when it was shot down. It had been flying over part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula and then was nearing Lake Huron when ultimately it was taken down by fighter aircraft. And what this senior administration official described is that it had an octagonal shape and there were strings hanging from it, but with no discernible payload. Another source who was briefed on the matter also shared that description. And while the U.S. has said that they haven't determined whether there was any intelligence collection capabilities to this object, they are simply not ruling that out at this moment. Now, this object was first detected by NORAD and NORCAM just last night. There was some radar contact that was made, and the U.S. sent some fighter aircraft to try to take a look and see if there was anything out there. Last night, they did not see an object and ultimately believed that it was an anomaly, a radar anomaly. But then today, they reacquired that radar contact and found this object that was going from Wisconsin over into Michigan. Now, there were concerns about the height of this aircraft. It was flying at 20,000 feet, and also its path. so there had been concerns about what it might mean for civilian aircraft, but officials say that it did not pose any imminent threat to people on the ground. But ultimately, President Biden followed the advice of his military leaders and ordered that this unidentified object be shot down. So that is what transpired today. But just to step back, this is just the latest in a series of remarkable events over the course of the last 8 days. This is the fourth time that the U.S. has shot down an aerial object in North American airspace, starting with that Chinese spy balloon, which traversed across the country for days and was ultimately shot down off the Carolina coast. Now there is this trio of unidentified objects with very few descriptors and big questions about where exactly they came from and who they belong to. The two objects that were shot down on Friday and then Saturday, we still have very limited details in what exactly these objects contained and looked like. Officials here have said that they were smaller than that Chinese spy balloon that was shot down off the waters of the East Coast. But certainly so many questions for this administration, as we have just seen unidentified object after unidentified object entering U.S. airspace, and there's questions about where they came from and what exactly it all means.
So many questions. Arlette Saenz, thank you. And let's talk more about this with CNN military analyst, retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton, and CNN's national security analyst, Juliette Kayyem. All right, Colonel, thank you for being with us. What is your reaction to this?
Well, this is really interesting, and Arlette's reporting is really piqued my interest, because what you're seeing here is something that I don't think we've seen before, an octagonal object. So I don't know if that's a payload or if that's actually the balloon or the propulsion system or something else like that. So we don't have very many details, but these are the kinds of questions that we definitely have to be asking. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting from this octagonal object, we have strings coming out. Strings could be all kinds of things, but I'm looking at the possibility of those strings being antennas of one type or another, either for receiving or for transmitting information. So that's the kind of stuff that we have to analyze. You have to have the DoD and other forensic specialists analyze this and really take a look at what the system actually is, how it connects with the other systems that were shot down earlier, if it does connect at all. Those are the kinds of questions that I have right now. I also note one other thing, if I may, and that's the relatively low altitude that this thing was flying at. 20,000 feet is absolutely within the realm of commercial aircraft, and that's extremely dangerous from a commercial aviation perspective. And the skies over Michigan are fairly well populated, so it's definitely something that needed to be taken care of.
And Juliette, I want to get your reaction to this. Another day, another shoot down of a so-called object.
I want to put this in the categories of what we know and what we don't know. So what we know is that since the Chinese balloon incident a week ago, and learning of other infiltrations by the Chinese of the balloon in years past, essentially NORAD, NORTHCOM, and other agencies essentially what you call opened up the aperture of what they were looking for. So they're getting lots of positives that they did not get before. Most of that is going to be known airplanes, whatever it may be, but there are now going to be lots more things that sort of raise the level of concern. So that's the first thing we know. These positives were anticipated, more positives. What we can't answer now is this sort of bigger aperture picking up lots of stuff that has essentially been forgiven, sort of around in the skies, whatever else it is, because it didn't pose a threat, or is it part of something organized for whatever surveillance? I do want to, so we don't know, and I would just want to pick up on what the congressman who was on before us, to speculate about China in all of these incidents is just, I'm sorry, it is just not right now. We do not know what these objects are. Two are described as VW size. One is now octangle. We don't know if there's balloons attached to them. So we need to just sort of understand what's going on. There's a wider lens of surveillance that is picking up things. We don't quite know what they are. And our tolerance for it after what happened with China is lower. We're going to shoot it down if it is unmanned, if it's hurting commercial or a threat to commercial aviation, and if shooting it down will not harm Americans in the homeland. That is essentially what's going on. The speculation is really premature at this stage.
And Colonel, you talked a little bit about civilian airspace. Clearly, these could potentially pose a threat to civilian aviation. Is there any way to really secure the skies against these kinds of objects?
Well, it's certainly a challenge, Paula. And, when we look at how we've secured the skies in the past, we've sometimes used draconian measures such as shutting things down in the wake of 9/11, for example, until we had a reasonable handle on what was flying in our airspace. I don't advocate anything like that at this particular point in time. The danger to commercial aviation is, I would say, minimal at this point, but it is something that has to be taken into account. And airmen of all types, civilian as well as military, have to be on the lookout for unusual objects right now. I think the heightened awareness on the part of everybody becomes really important. But having an ironclad, control mechanism for space, that's practically an impossibility. But we can certainly do a better job knowing what's in the air. And I think NORAD has certainly picked up the baton at this point in time, a little bit late, but still better late than never.
I hope no one bought a ticket or clicked on a YouTube link thinking I would be talking literally about hostile extraterrestrials. The idea of prepping for the alien invasion is a fun way into thinking about all those challenges that we see on the horizon, challenges that are complex, challenges that present us with a great deal of uncertainty, even though we know that they're coming. Challenges like climate change, rapid technological change, food security, public health. And I'll be speaking even more specifically about the importance of education in the humanities, arts and social sciences in preparing for these kinds of challenges. Now, some of you are probably thinking, this doesn't sound very TED. This doesn't sound like an innovative new idea. This sounds more like an angry old professor of sociology howling into the wind about changes that he just doesn't want to accept. Some of you are probably sympathetic to the idea of education in the humanities, arts and social sciences, and you might be wondering, well, where's this going? What's new? There's a constant drip feed of debate. Well, is it debate? Discussion that passes for debate in the media about the ongoing value or otherwise of the humanities and arts. Well, there certainly is a discourse out there, a narrative out there about the way in which rapid technological change ought to be reflected in our educational priorities. Technological disruption, artificial intelligence, big data, data fusion, synthetic biology, all of these new technologies will develop a digital economy in which safe, secure, reliable work depends on skills in the so-called STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, maths and medicine. I was going to make a joke about the two M's, kind of making it more STEM, but I thought that's probably going to be a bit lame. No one will laugh. See? Now, I have an Uncle Don. Maybe you have an Uncle Don, or if you don't have an Uncle Don, you probably have an Uncle Dave, or someone who's a bit like my Uncle Don. Now, when I was a teenager, and bear in mind for young people, I was a teenager back in the olden days, the 1980s, and Uncle Don was a bit of a regular at our place. And usually after dinner, almost always after dinner, Uncle Don would fix me in his gaze, he'd lean forward, he'd pause, he liked a dramatic pause, Uncle Don, and he'd say, computers. There was always another dramatic pause, say computers. Computers are going to be everywhere. You should do something with computers. And he was right. Computers are everywhere. Not that I ever became a computer scientist, but we all work with computers. He was right on both counts. Computers are everywhere, and I do something with computers. And people who say the same thing today about artificial intelligence, they're right too. People who say the same thing about big data, they're already right. We already live in the age of big data. We just haven't always figured out how best to manage that. Now, the way in which this sort of narrative about technological change is reflected in education systems varies from one educational jurisdiction to another, but there's a very consistent message that goes out to young people. You ought to be a part of this. And that sends a message to young people that if they want to be part of the future, not just secure themselves a reliable and satisfactory career, but if they want to be part of the future, if they want to play a role in shaping the kind of society they live in, they need to take the STEM path. So there's a counter-narrative that comes from people, generally people like me, people who've made careers in the humanities, arts and social sciences, and our counter-narrative says, well, yes, the digital economy is here. But even in the digital economy, we need the sorts of skills that you might learn if you're studying, whether it's at high school or primary school, high school, university, vocational training, lifelong learning. You need the sorts of skills that you'll develop through humanities, arts and social sciences. You need to learn effective communication. You need to unleash your creativity. You need to develop your critical thinking skills. And there's a grain of truth in this too. If you talk to employers, some of the things they value most in employees are exactly those attributes. Business surveys routinely identify people who can work in teams, solve problems in interesting new ways, and string more than one sentence together coherently as being exactly the sort of people they want to hire. Thinking beyond the labour market, I think it's fair to say that those sorts of skills are critical too to a functioning democracy. In the age of fake news and the hyperpolarisation of absolutely everything, I'm not sure if nevermore we've needed our critical thinking skills, but we certainly need them critically today. There's a few too many criticallys there, but it's critical. Now, critical thinking is not scepticism. Critical thinking is not cynicism. Critical thinking is the opposite of cynicism. Critical thinking is knowing how to weigh evidence, consider alternatives, examine your own assumptions, test your assumptions, maintain an open mind, accept that you could be wrong, be very clear about where you're uncertain and how you manage that uncertainty. Critical thinking is the exact opposite of cynicism. It's the exact opposite of conspiracy thinking. Critical thinking is the exact opposite of disagreeing with people because you think they might vote differently to you. They might have worn the wrong colour t-shirt or they might have the wrong slogan. Critical thinking is about maintaining that openness. Creative expression is just as important to a functioning democracy. Where do we get our sense of community? If we don't want to generate sense of community through us and them, through polarising, through black and white, Australian, un-Australian, cyclists, non-cyclists, where do we get our sense of collective identity? We get it through those shared expressions of who we are. And when we experience those, we start to see things from other people's perspectives. We start to experience something of another way of life, another culture. We start to develop that connection, that emotional as well as that cognitive connection that says, you know, we are a community, not only despite our differences, but in many ways because of our differences. Now, the problem with this argument as a basis for maintaining our educational investment in the humanities, arts and social sciences is that you don't actually need to study the humanities, arts and social sciences in order to develop your communication, creativity or critical thinking. Any well-designed curricula in any discipline will help students develop these kinds of attributes. My first degree was in agricultural science, not in a social science. And I've worked with agricultural and environmental and other kinds of sciences my whole career. I can't imagine science without creativity and critical thinking. In my mind, those two things are exactly what science is. Any kind of science, social, natural, or otherwise. New ideas, robust testing. Always looking for alternative explanations, better ways of seeing the world, always going to the data, trying to find ways to prove yourself wrong. And how counter is that to the hyperpolarisation of social life? A whole enterprise that's based on people checking and rechecking that they could be wrong, that someone else might actually be right. I've never studied medicine or engineering, but I can't imagine people engaging in large engineering projects or running complex medical practices without teamwork and problem solving. So if it's important for people like me to maintain our educational, and for that matter our research presence in the humanities, arts and social sciences, we need a better argument than generic skills. Everything we teach young people should be developing those generic skills. We need to address the more substantive issues. Now, I began by speaking about, amongst other challenges, rapid technological change. If you look through any technological revolution in history, you'll see that it was a social revolution, a political revolution, an institutional revolution, an economic revolution, and a cultural revolution. Every period of profound change requires the insight and the skills of people with backgrounds in humanities, arts, and social sciences. Let me talk briefly about one example that's dear to me. What does rapid technological change mean for Australian agriculture, international agriculture? What does it mean for issues like food security in light of a changing climate? Technological options that are now with us today give us all sorts of opportunities to address those challenges in interesting new ways. Synthetic biology promises us far more productive plants and animals. Advanced sensing, the Internet of Things, big data, data analytics, these promise much more efficient processes of land and natural resource management. Telecommunications and distributed ledger technology promise us access to new markets, creating new relationships between producers and buyers. We've got opportunities for new products, for new production systems, for new marketing and business systems. We can come at this in all sorts of interesting new ways, but none of this is inevitable. And positive social and economic outcomes are far from inevitable. So how do we generate those? Well, I'd argue we need to develop three kinds of infrastructure. And every one of those infrastructures requires the expertise of people in the social sciences. We need physical infrastructure. Now that's going to surprise you. What's the role of the social sciences in putting together networks of satellites and sensors and wires and optical cable and all sorts of other things that create the connection that we need to use most of this technology? Well, putting those things together into viable systems requires planning and business analysis and economics. The second kind of infrastructure we need is regulatory infrastructure. Now, obviously there's a role there for law. There's also a role there for regulatory theorists and public administrators. Without the right regulatory apparatus, we don't provide innovators, large or small, with the certainty they have to invest their time and money, and we don't provide technology users with the certainty that their interests will be protected when they purchase and use this technology. The third kind of infrastructure we need is institutional infrastructure. Not one big institution. I'm not talking about the Department for the Digital Economy. I'm talking about all the connections we have between innovators, researchers, educators, investors, students, and so on, that together start to pull together really interesting and exciting regional innovation ecosystems. Every technological revolution has been a social, an economic, a cultural, an institutional revolution. If we want to get the benefits of rapid technological change, whether it's in agriculture or any other domain of human inquiry, of human effort, it has to be about the people. It has to be about the community. Because when we pull these things together, when we utilise the full range of skills that we have at our disposal, and I think you would have picked up that I'm very positively disposed towards disciplines like science. This is not a zero-sum argument. We have enough polarisation. We don't need polarisation between the disciplines. We need education and we need innovation systems that pull these things together. Every revolution is a social revolution. The future is not about disruption. The future is about community. The future is about us.
What? I like big butts and I cannot lie. You other brothers can't deny. When a girl walks in with an itty bitty waist and a round thing in your face, you get strong. Wanna pull up tough cause you notice that butt was stuck deep in the jeans she's wearing. I'm hooked and I can't stop staring. Oh baby, I wanna get with ya and take your picture. My homeboys tried to warn me, but that butt you got me. Ooh, rapper smooth skin. You say you wanna get in my bins? Well, use me, cause you ain't that average groupie. I seen her dancing, to hell with romancing. She's sweating, and I'm tired of magazines saying black butts are the thing. Check the average black man and ask him that. She gotta pack much back. Where's my fellows? Fellows! If your girlfriend got the butt, tell him to shake it, shake it, shake that big old butt, and baby got back. Yeah. He's smiling his ass off.